The whisper came before Daniel Cole even looked up from his screen. "Take me somewhere private." He thought he had misheard her. Elena Hartley never said anything that did not need to be said. She was the kind of assistant who color-coded his calendar by mood and remembered which clients drank coffee and which ones lied about not drinking coffee. In 8 months working 2 desks down from him, she had never once leaned this close, never once lowered her voice like there was something in the air that could hear them. He turned his chair. Her hand was pressed flat against the edge of his desk, knuckles pale, like she was holding the desk in place instead of the other way around. "Elena, what? Not here." Her eyes flicked toward the glass wall of his office, toward the open floor where 20 other people typed and answered phones and pretended not to notice anything. "Please, 5 minutes. That is all I am asking." Daniel had been a single father for 2 years. He had learned to read fear on a child's face long before she could explain what was wrong. The stomach ache before the math test, the silence after a fight with a friend. He saw the same thing now on a grown woman's face, and it scared him more than he expected. He stood up. "Conference room B is free," he said, keeping his voice the same flat, ordinary tone he used when Lily came home upset and he did not want to spook her into silence. Elena shook her head before he finished the sentence. "Not a room with windows." So they walked instead, past the kitchen where someone was arguing about whose yogurt had gone missing, past the line of cubicles where nobody looked up, toward the stairwell door at the end of the hallway, the one maintenance used, the one without a glass wall and without, as far as Daniel knew, a working camera. The door closed behind them with a sound that felt louder than it should have been. Concrete stairwells hold silence differently than offices do. Daniel noticed that for the first time in his life, standing there with his secretary, watching her hands shake, while she tried to open a manila folder she had carried against her chest, the entire walk over. "I need you to listen to everything before you say anything," Elena said. "I checked this 4 times. I did not want to come to you until I was sure." "Sure of what?" She opened the folder. Daniel looked down at a stack of invoices, wire transfer authorizations, vendor agreements with a shipping name he did not recognize, a company called Falcon Crest Logistics, supposedly based 2 states over. At the bottom of every page, a signature. His signature. Except it was not his signature. The letters were close enough to pass a glance, but the loop on the C in his last name curved the wrong way, the way it had curved on a check he had once bounced in college, and never made that mistake again. "I did not sign these," he said. "I know." Elena's voice had gone very quiet, very careful, the voice of someone choosing each word like it might detonate. "That is the problem." He flipped through the dates. The 3rd invoice was stamped from a week he remembered clearly, because he had been on a beach in Mexico with Lily, her first trip outside the country, sunscreen in her hair for 3 days afterward no matter how many times he washed it. The 5th invoice was from a Tuesday he had spent in a pediatrician's waiting room because Lily had a fever that turned out to be nothing. He had alibis for every single date. He had never needed alibis before in his life, and now he had them anyway, and that fact alone made his stomach drop in a way he did not have a name for yet. "Someone has been using your name for almost a year," Elena said. 11 invoices, always between $40,000 and $60,000, always approved within 48 hours. No questions, no second signature required, because anything under your authorization level skips the secondary review. "How did you find this?" "I was reconciling a vendor account in March. Falcon Crest does not have a working phone line past 3 digits, no warehouse address that exists. I thought it was a clerical mistake at first. Then I found the second one. Then I stopped sleeping properly." Daniel rubbed his face with one hand, the folder still open in the other. 11 months of his own name turned into a weapon against him without his knowledge. "Why didn't you bring this to HR? Or to me weeks ago?" Elena's jaw tightened. For a second, Daniel thought she might not answer at all. "Because I went to Garrett first," she said. "In April. I asked him about the vendor approval that let Falcon Crest skip verification. He told me I was getting ahead of my pay grade and that I should stick to scheduling. 3 weeks later, a woman named Priya from Accounts Payable, who had asked almost the exact same question 2 months before I did, got restructured out of the company. No warning. No severance package that made sense for someone with her seniority. Gone." The name Garrett Voss landed in Daniel's chest like a dropped weight. Garrett ran the finance division. Garrett had final approval over every vendor list in the building. Garrett had been the one to recommend Daniel for his current position 3 years ago, had taken him to lunch to celebrate, had shaken his hand with the kind of grip that meant something back when Daniel still believed handshakes meant something. You think Garrett is behind this? I think Garrett's initials are on the document that let a company with no real address skip every verification step we have. I think the only person whose signature appears on the wire authorizations is yours, which makes you the one holding the bag if anyone ever audits this properly. And I think the open floor plan upstairs has 3 microphones built into the ceiling tiles that nobody in this building can explain, officially, for a logistics company that ships boxes for a living. Daniel had walked past those ceiling tiles 1,000 times without looking up. Why come to me with this in a stairwell, Elena? Why not just walk into compliance directly? Because if this goes to compliance and it gets buried, or slowed down, or quietly handed back to Garrett's department to investigate itself, you become the only name on every fraudulent document in this building. You lose your job, maybe worse than your job, and I will have handed you the evidence and then disappeared the same way Priya did, and nobody will even remember my name by then. The fear on her face was not performance. Daniel had spent 2 years learning the difference between a person performing calm and a person who had simply run out of other options, because he had been both of those people in the same week more than once since his wife died, and he recognized the second one now, looking back at him in a stairwell that smelled like dust and old paint. Okay, he said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. Show me everything you have. Elena exhaled like she had been holding that breath since March. Not here, she said again. Not on company Wi-Fi, not on a company laptop, and not anywhere near that 4th floor. Daniel thought about Lily, waiting for him at her after-school program in 4 hours, expecting pizza night and a movie they had already watched 6 times because she liked knowing exactly what happened next. He thought about the 11 invoices with his name forged across the bottom, sitting in a building with cameras he could not trust, and microphones nobody could explain. He thought about Priya, a name he had never heard until 90 seconds ago, pushed out of her own career for asking one question too many. There's a coffee place 2 blocks from Lily's school, he said. Nobody from this office goes there. We can talk after I pick her up, once she's settled with a movie. Elena nodded, closed the folder, and held it against her chest, the same way she had carried it down the hallway, like it weighed more than paper should. They walked back to their desks separately, 3 minutes apart, the way people walk when they have decided, without saying so out loud, that someone might be watching. Daniel sat back down at his desk and stared at his monitor without seeing anything on it. Somewhere on the 4th floor, behind a door with his old college friend's name on it, 11 invoices sat in a system with his forged signature attached to all of them, and a woman named Priya had vanished from her job for asking half the question Elena had just asked him in full. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number, no name attached, sent at 4:58 in the afternoon while he was still sitting at his desk pretending to work. It said 3 words. Be careful, Daniel. He looked up, scanning the open floor, the rows of cubicles, the glass wall of Garrett's office on the far end. Nobody was looking back at him. Nobody seemed to be paying him any attention at all. That was somehow worse. He spent the next 90 minutes refreshing nothing in particular, watching the clock count down to the only deadline that mattered to him most days, the deadline of his daughter waiting somewhere with construction paper and watercolors, and her own small worries about the day. He drove to her after-school program with the unknown number's message still glowing somewhere behind his eyes, 3 words that didn't tell him what to be careful of, only that someone out there already knew. Lily ran out to the car the way she always did, a yellow backpack twice as scuffed as it had been in September, a drawing rolled in one fist that she refused to flatten because she said the curl made it look like it was flying. He used to be able to listen to her stories about recess politics and not think about anything else for the length of the drive home. Tonight he caught himself checking the mirror 3 times before they reached the first stop sign, watching a gray sedan that turned left exactly when he turned left, that vanished 2 blocks later when he finally convinced himself he was imagining things. He dropped Lily with Donna Shaw, the retired teacher 2 doors down who had been watching her on short notice since the funeral, since the year everything in Daniel's life had been rearranged by a diagnosis nobody saw coming, and a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and goodbye. Donna asked no questions when he said he needed an hour for a work thing. Donna never asked questions. It was one of several reasons he trusted her with the only person in the world he could not afford to lose. The coffee shop 2 blocks from Lily's school was nearly empty by the time he arrived, a narrow place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that hadn't been updated since spring. Elena was already in the back corner booth, the folder now hidden inside a canvas tote bag, a laptop open in front of her that Daniel was fairly sure did not belong to Halloran Freight Logistics. She looked up when the bell over the door rang, and for one unguarded second, before she rearranged her face into the careful calm she'd been wearing all afternoon, Daniel saw something underneath it that looked almost like relief. The relief of a person who had been carrying something alone for 3 months, and had finally set part of it down. "You came," she said. "Somebody told me to be careful," Daniel answered, sliding into the seat across from her. "I figured that meant I should probably hear the rest of it." Elena turned the laptop toward him. A spreadsheet filled the screen, rows and columns Daniel didn't fully understand yet, except for one thing he understood immediately. The numbers went much higher, and much further back, than 11 invoices. "There's more," she said. "A lot more. And it's worse than I told you upstairs." Outside the window, a gray sedan pulled into a parking spot across the street, and did not turn off its engine. Daniel didn't say anything about it. He filed it away the way he had learned to file away bad news since his wife's diagnosis, in a separate compartment that he could open later, when he had enough information to know how scared to actually be. "Walk me through the spreadsheet," he said instead. Elena scrolled to the top of the document, a master ledger she said she had been building in pieces since April. Every Falcon Crest transaction cross-referenced against 3 other vendor names that didn't quite check out either: Bridgepoint Distribution, Marrow Creek Supply, a third one called Anchor Line Freight that had appeared only 6 weeks ago. "They rotate the company names," Elena said. "Falcon Crest gets flagged on one audit, they retire it, and open Bridgepoint with a slightly different routing number. Same pattern every time. $40,000 to $60,000 increments. Always under your signature, or under one of 2 other managers in the building who I think don't even know yet." 2 others? A woman in receiving named Carla Drummond, a man in regional sales named Patrick Boone. Neither one has noticed anything wrong as far as I can tell, which means either they're in on it, or they're exactly where you were 3 hours ago, used, blind. Daniel thought about Patrick, a friendly, slightly disorganized man who brought donuts to Monday meetings and talked too much about his fantasy football league. He didn't seem like a man capable of building a criminal enterprise. He seemed like exactly the kind of man someone else would choose to frame, because nobody would ever suspect him of anything bigger than forgetting to refill the coffee machine. "How much money are we talking about total?" Elena hesitated before she answered, which told Daniel the number was worse than anything he'd braced for. Just under $2.1 million. Over 14 months. The number sat between them on the table like a third person nobody had invited to the booth. "That's not embezzlement for a new boat, Elena. That's a structure. Somebody built a system. I think it's bigger than the company," she said, and her voice dropped low enough that Daniel had to lean forward to catch it over the espresso machine hissing behind the counter. 3 of the routing numbers trace back to a financial holding company registered in a state that doesn't require disclosure of beneficial owners. I looked it up. It took me 2 weeks of late nights to find even that much, and I'm not someone who knows how to dig much deeper without getting noticed. "Noticed by who?" "By whoever sent you that text message an hour ago." Daniel looked back out the window. The gray sedan was still there, engine idling, headlights off even though the sky outside had gone the deep blue of early evening. He couldn't see the driver's face from this angle, only the outline of a person sitting very still, the kind of stillness that wasn't waiting for someone, it was watching someone. "We need to leave," he said, separately, different directions. Elena closed the laptop and slid it back into her bag without arguing. "There's a man I trust," she said, standing up, voice low. "Victor Reyes. He used to work compliance at a different logistics company 2 states over, before he came to Halloran. I think he left his last job because of something similar to this. I haven't told him anything yet, but I think he's the only person in that building who might actually do something instead of just filing a report that gets quietly buried. Set up a meeting, somewhere that isn't this coffee shop and isn't the office. Tomorrow morning, there's a diner near the train station, opens at 6. Nobody from Halloran gets up that early except the warehouse crew, and they don't drink coffee that costs $4 a cup." They left through separate doors, Elena out the back past the restrooms, Daniel out the front, walking the opposite direction from his car for 2 blocks, before doubling back through a parking garage, a maneuver he'd only ever seen in movies and felt slightly ridiculous performing in real life, right up until he reached his car and found the gray sedan gone from its spot across the street. He told himself that meant nothing. He didn't believe it. Donna Shaw's porch light was on when he picked up Lily, the two of them sitting on the front steps working through a word search puzzle book that Lily insisted on doing out loud, sounding out each letter like it was a small discovery. Daniel scooped her up despite her protests that she was 7 now, not a baby, and carried her the short distance to the car anyway, because some nights he needed the weight of her more than she needed the ride. "You smell like coffee," Lily said, wrinkling her nose. "I had a work meeting. Was it boring?" Daniel buckled her into the back seat and thought about $2.1 million and a gray sedan with its headlights off. "A little," he said. "Pizza night still on?" The drive home took 11 minutes, the same 11 minutes it always took, past the same gas station and the same elementary school and the same row of maple trees that Lily liked to count out loud. Nothing followed them. Nothing seemed wrong. Daniel kept checking the mirror anyway, the way he'd been checking it since the unknown number's text message, and somewhere around the 4th check he caught himself and made himself stop because Lily was watching him in the reflection and her small face had already learned to read worry on his. "Daddy, are you okay?" "I'm okay, Bug, just tired." She accepted that answer the way 7-year-olds accept most explanations from their parents, with a nod and a quick return to the much more important business of deciding whether the pizza should have pineapple on it, a debate they had been having for 2 years and showed no signs of resolving. Pizza night went the way pizza night always went, a movie they'd seen too many times, Lily asleep on the couch by 8:40, the way she always was on the nights she pretended hardest not to be tired. Daniel carried her to bed, the same routine, the same nightlight shaped like a moon that she'd had since before her mother died, the same 3-minute ritual of checking under the bed for nothing in particular because it made her feel better and cost him nothing to do. With Lily asleep, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with his own laptop, because curiosity finally outweighed caution. He searched the address listed on the Falcon Crest invoices, a street number in a town 2 states over that he had never once driven through. The image that loaded was a wide gravel lot beside a closed tire shop, no building taller than a chain-link fence, nothing that could plausibly house a logistics company moving tens of thousands of dollars in freight charges every month. He zoomed in until the picture blurred into colored squares, and still found nothing. No loading bay, no trucks, no sign that anything had ever existed there beyond weeds and a faded sign advertising tires that nobody had sold in years. He tried the phone number next, the one printed neatly at the top of every Falcon Crest invoice, and got 3 rings before a recorded voice told him the number was no longer in service. He tried Bridgepoint Distribution's number and got the same 3 rings, the same recording, word for word, which told him more than any spreadsheet could have, that whoever built this had reused not just the routing patterns but the exact disconnected line, copying a template and barely bothering to change it. He thought about pulling up Marrow Creek Supply next, and then thought better of it, remembering Elena's warning about company Wi-Fi, about anything that could be traced back to a search history with his name attached to it. He closed the laptop instead and sat in the quiet kitchen for a long moment, listening to the refrigerator hum and the house settle around him the way it always did this time of night. He thought about his wife, the way he still sometimes did when the house got too quiet, wondering what she would have made of all this, whether she would have told him to walk away the moment the word forgery entered his vocabulary, or whether she would have been the one pushing him forward, the way she'd pushed him forward through every hard decision in the 11 years they'd had together, before the diagnosis took the choice away from both of them. She had never been a woman who backed down from a fight she believed was worth having. He liked to think some of that had rubbed off on him, even if most days it felt like he was only borrowing her courage, wearing it the way Lily sometimes wore her mother's old scarf around the house. Too big, not quite hers, but warm anyway. He went up to check on Lily one more time before bed, watching the slow, even rise and fall of her breathing in the glow of the moon-shaped nightlight, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm exactly where she always kept it. Whatever else was happening in his life, none of it had touched this room yet, and he intended to keep it that way for as long as it was within his power to manage. It was nearly 11 when he heard the sound outside. Not a loud sound. A scrape, metal against the side of the house, the kind of sound that could be a raccoon, could be the wind moving a loose gutter, could be nothing at all. Daniel had lived in this house for 6 years and had heard exactly that kind of sound 100 times before and never once thought twice about it. Tonight he thought about it. He moved through the dark kitchen without turning on a light, the way he used to move through the hospital hallway at 3 in the morning when Lily's mother was still alive, and every sound in the dark had meant something. He looked out the side window above the sink and saw nothing, just the narrow gap between his house and the fence line, shadows that could have been anything. Then a beam of light swept across the yard, low and quick, the kind of motion made by a flashlight in someone's hand who didn't want to be seen using it. Daniel's pulse climbed into his throat. Upstairs, Lily was asleep with her moon nightlight and her stuffed rabbit, and absolutely no idea that her father was standing in the dark kitchen watching a stranger's flashlight cross their backyard. He didn't call out. He didn't turn on the porch light. He picked up his phone, fingers steadier than he expected, and dialed the only number that felt like it mattered in that moment. Elena answered on the second ring, her voice already low, already careful, like she'd been waiting for a call she didn't want to get. "Someone's in my backyard," Daniel said. A pause, then, quietly, "Don't go outside. Lock every door you can reach without making noise. I'm calling Victor right now, and I'm coming to you. My daughter is asleep upstairs. Then lock the doors, Daniel, and stay between her and the stairs." He locked the back door first, then the side door off the laundry room, moving low and fast, his bare feet silent against the hardwood his late wife had picked out years ago because she liked the way the morning light hit it. The flashlight beam crossed the yard once more, paused at the fence line, and disappeared. 10 minutes felt like an hour. Daniel sat at the bottom of the staircase, between his sleeping daughter and the front door, a kitchen knife he'd grabbed without quite deciding to grab it resting on the step beside him, more for the comfort of having something in reach than out of any real belief he'd need it. Headlights swept across the living room ceiling at 1:45. Daniel went rigid until he recognized the shape of the car pulling into his driveway, not a gray sedan, but Elena's small blue hatchback, parking at an angle that suggested she hadn't taken the time to straighten it out. She came up the front walk fast, a second person behind her that Daniel didn't recognize, a tall man in a jacket too heavy for the season, moving with the kind of alert stillness that made Daniel think, correctly, that this must be Victor Reyes. "Nobody's in the yard now," Daniel said, opening the door before they could knock and risk waking Lily. "Flashlight, maybe 10 minutes ago. Gone since." Victor walked the perimeter of the house himself before saying a word, checking the fence line, the gate latch, the gap beside the garage where the flashlight beam had paused longest. When he came back around to the front, his expression had settled into something grim and focused. "Footprints by the gas meter," he said. "Fresh. Whoever it was knew exactly where your meter access panel was, which tells me this wasn't random and it wasn't kids. That's not a place anyone checks unless they've looked up your address and your utility provider ahead of time. What were they doing at the meter? Could be nothing. Could be checking whether you're home based on usage patterns. Could be something I don't want to guess out loud standing on your front lawn at midnight." Victor's eyes moved toward the upstairs window, toward the soft glow of a moon-shaped nightlight visible through the curtain. "You have a daughter, 7 years old, asleep. Then we need to talk inside, with the doors locked, and we need to talk fast." Victor didn't explain right away why a stranger's report of a flashlight in a backyard had pulled him out of bed at midnight without hesitation, agreeing to come the moment Elena called. He explained it later, sitting at the kitchen table, almost as an aside, the way people sometimes share the thing that matters most without making it the centerpiece of the conversation. "I worked compliance for 6 years at a freight company, 2 states over," he said. "Found something that looked a lot like this. Smaller maybe, but the same shape. I brought it to my director instead of going outside the company first, because I trusted the process the way you're supposed to. 2 months later I was let go for, and I'm quoting the termination letter here, a restructuring of departmental priorities. I never proved it was connected. I never had to. I just knew, the way you know things in your gut before your head catches up, and I promised myself if I ever saw that shape again, I wouldn't make the same mistake twice." It was the most Daniel had heard him say at once, and it explained, more than anything else could have, the particular urgency in the way Victor had walked the fence line outside, checking for footprints with the focus of a man who had once trusted a system and watched it fail someone else first. They sat at Daniel's kitchen table, the same table where Lily did her homework every afternoon, papers and crayons still scattered across one end. while Victor laid out what 8 years in compliance work had taught him to recognize. A layered fraud structure built to survive an audit, rotating vendor names, forged signatures spread across multiple managers to dilute suspicion, and now, escalating fast, direct surveillance of at least one person who had started asking questions. "This isn't a man skimming money for a vacation home," Victor said. "This is infrastructure. Whoever built it has done this before, somewhere else, and got good at not getting caught. The fact that someone showed up at your house tonight means they already know Elena talked to you, which means somebody inside that building is watching both of you a lot closer than either of you realized." Daniel looked toward the staircase, toward the dark hallway leading up to his daughter's room. "What do we do?" Victor was quiet for a moment, weighing something. "Tomorrow, we don't go to your company's compliance department," he finally said. "We go over it. I have a contact, someone I trust at the federal level, who handles exactly this kind of case. Wire fraud across state lines, shell companies. This is well past what your HR department is equipped to handle, and frankly, well past what's safe for either of you to keep investigating alone." Elena's hand found the edge of the table, the same grip Daniel had noticed in the stairwell that afternoon, knuckles pale, holding on. "What happens to us if Garrett finds out before we get there first?" she asked. Nobody at the table answered that question, because nobody wanted to say out loud what had already happened to a woman named Priya for asking less than half of what Elena had already uncovered. The diner near the train station smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease, and it was nearly empty at 6 in the morning except for 2 men in reflective vests finishing breakfast before a shift, and a woman in a gray blazer sitting alone in the back booth, a manila folder of her own resting beside her coffee cup. Victor introduced her as Nora Bellamy, though he didn't say which agency until they were all seated and the waitress had taken their order and walked away. "Federal," Nora said, sliding a business card across the table that gave Daniel almost no information beyond a name and a phone number. "I've been working a case for the last 14 months involving shell companies and shipping fraud across 4 states. I won't pretend I expected it to walk in through a diner door at 6 in the morning, but here we are." Elena handed over the laptop. Nora scrolled through the spreadsheet with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had read 1,000 documents like it before and knew exactly which numbers mattered. Falcon Crest, Bridgepoint, Anchor Line. She read the names out loud like she already recognized them. "We've had 2 of these flagged in a separate investigation out of state. Different company, same pattern, same rotation schedule. If your numbers match what I think they match, this isn't just fraud against your employer. This is a laundering operation, moving money through fake freight invoices, and freight companies make excellent cover, because nobody questions a shipping charge the way they'd question a check with no explanation." "Laundering money from what?" Daniel asked. Nora's expression didn't change, but something behind it went carefully blank, the look of a person deciding how much truth a civilian needed to hear. "That's still being determined. I'd rather not speculate out loud in a diner. What I can tell you is that 2 informants connected to a similar case in another state stopped cooperating very suddenly, and one of them moved out of the country without telling anyone where. I'm not saying that to scare you. I'm saying it because you both need to understand exactly what kind of people you may be dealing with before you decide how far you're willing to go to help build this case." The warning landed exactly where it was meant to. "Someone was in my backyard last night," Daniel said. "My 7-year-old daughter was asleep upstairs." Nora's jaw tightened, the first real crack in her composure since she'd sat down. "Then you need to get her somewhere safe, today, and you need to let me build this case from here, with as little exposure for either of you as possible. I'll take the spreadsheet. I'll take copies of the invoices. What I need from you, Elena, is continued access inside the building, without doing anything that draws attention, until we have enough for a warrant." "And Garrett?" Elena asked. "He already knows I've been asking questions." "Then you keep your head down and act like a woman who got scared off in April and never thought about it again. Can you do that?" Elena's silence said more than agreement would have. Daniel left the diner with Nora's warning still sitting heavy in his chest. 2 informants who'd stopped cooperating, one who'd vanished entirely, and instead of driving straight to the office, he found himself turning the car toward Lily's elementary school instead, telling himself he only wanted to see her face through the classroom window, for 30 seconds before the day swallowed him whole. He parked across the street from the school just as the morning drop-off line was thinning out, yellow buses pulling away, the last few parents walking their children up the front steps. He wasn't planning to get out of the car. He told himself that twice, sitting there with the engine idling, watching the front entrance the way he used to watch hospital monitors, looking for nothing in particular, and everything at once. A man near the side fence caught his attention before he understood why. The man wasn't dropping off a child. He wasn't picking one up either, not yet. Standing instead near the chain-link fence that bordered the playground, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the second-grade line file out toward the morning assembly, with an attention that didn't match anything a stranger should have for children he had no connection to. Daniel watched him for a full minute, telling himself he was being paranoid, right up until the man's eyes tracked Lily specifically as she walked past in line, her yellow backpack unmistakable even from across the street, and stayed on her for 3 full seconds longer than they stayed on any other child in that line. Daniel was out of the car before he'd finished deciding to move. He crossed the street fast, reaching the front office before the man at the fence had so much as turned his head, and found the school secretary, a woman named Greta who had worked the front desk longer than Lily had been alive, already halfway through dialing a number on the office phone. "There's a man by the playground fence," Daniel said, breathing harder than the short walk should have justified. "He's not picking up a kid. He was watching my daughter." Greta's face shifted instantly from mild concern to focused alarm, the particular alertness of someone who had run lockdown drills more times than she wanted to count, and took every version of this seriously. "I saw him too, on the camera. I was just calling it in." Within 4 minutes, a school resource officer had crossed the front lawn toward the fence, and the man, whoever he was, had already turned and walked briskly toward a parking lot 2 streets over, moving with the unhurried pace of someone who knew exactly how long he could afford to stay visible before it became a problem. By the time the officer reached the spot where he'd been standing, there was nothing left to find except a single cigarette butt ground into the grass, and the lingering, useless feeling of having seen danger up close and watched it walk calmly away. Daniel sat in the front office for 20 minutes after that, filling out an incident report with hands that wouldn't quite stay steady, while a teacher's aide brought Lily down from her classroom under the gentle fiction that her father had a surprise for her, a fiction Daniel did his best to make true by taking her out for an early lunch she hadn't earned and didn't ask too many questions about. He didn't tell her about the man at the fence. He didn't tell her, sitting across from her at a booth with chicken nuggets going cold between them, that he'd already decided, somewhere in the 4 minutes between spotting the stranger and watching him disappear, that she wasn't sleeping under this roof again until whatever was circling his life had been caught or had given up. "I have to do a work thing for a little while," he told her instead, the same careful half-truth he'd been refining all week. "I think it's time for that trip to see Aunt Carrie." Lily considered this with the seriousness of a 7-year-old weighing a genuinely important decision. "Can I bring my markers?" "You can bring whatever you want, Bug." He called his sister from the parking lot before they'd even finished lunch, his voice steady in a way that cost him everything he had left that day to maintain, and by evening her flight was already booked. His sister didn't ask too many questions, the way Donna never did, the way people who loved you sometimes knew not to ask. He packed Lily's bag himself that evening, her moon nightlight wrapped carefully in a sweater so it wouldn't break, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm of the suitcase where she could find it without looking. "Is this because of your boring meeting?" Lily asked, watching him fold a 3rd pair of pajamas she didn't need. "It's because Aunt Carrie misses you," Daniel said, which wasn't a lie, exactly, just an incomplete truth, the kind he'd been telling more and more since the diner that morning. He drove her to the airport himself 2 days later, walked her through security as far as they'd let him go, and watched her small yellow backpack disappear around a corner with a flight attendant holding her hand, doing everything in his power not to let his face show how much it cost him to let her go. The drive back from the airport took him along the interstate for 11 miles before he noticed a dark blue pickup truck holding the same distance behind him for longer than coincidence should allow, 3 car lengths back through 2 lane changes, matching his speed exactly when he eased off the gas to test it. He took the next exit without signaling, a small mercy of habit from years of driving Lily to school the back way to avoid a construction zone, and watched in the mirror as the pickup truck took the same exit 4 seconds later. His pulse climbed into a register he was getting uncomfortably familiar with. He drove 2 blocks into a part of town he didn't know well, made a sharp right into a strip mall parking lot, and pulled into a space between 2 delivery vans, killing his engine and watching the entrance through his side mirror. The pickup truck didn't follow him into the lot. It rolled past on the main road instead, slow, unhurried. The driver's face turned just enough toward the strip mall that Daniel caught the impression of sunglasses and a baseball cap pulled low. Nothing he could have described to a sketch artist beyond the bare fact that someone had been looking for him and had just confirmed they'd lost him. For now. He sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes after the truck disappeared, hands flat against the steering wheel, breathing slow and deliberate the way he'd taught himself to breathe in hospital waiting rooms when panic threatened to take over a moment that needed his full attention. When he finally trusted himself to drive again, he took a route to the office that doubled back twice and added 20 minutes to a normal 12-minute trip, checking his mirrors at every turn until the habit stopped feeling paranoid and started feeling, simply, necessary. He called Elena from the parking garage before going inside, keeping his voice low even though he was alone. "I think someone followed me from the airport," he said. "Blue pickup truck. Lost them in a strip mall lot, but I don't think it was an accident." Elena was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. "That's not good. That means they know Lily left town, which means they know exactly why you sent her away. Or it means they're watching both of us closer than we thought." "Either way," she said, her voice tightening, "we need to be more careful than we have been, starting now." The office, when he returned to it that Thursday, felt different in a way he couldn't fully explain. Garrett's door stayed closed more than usual. 2 new faces appeared near the loading dock, men in plain jackets who didn't wear company badges and didn't introduce themselves to anyone, standing near the warehouse entrance with the kind of stillness Daniel had started to recognize from a gray sedan outside a coffee shop. Elena passed him in the hallway Friday afternoon, eyes forward, voice barely above a whisper, as she handed him a folder of unrelated paperwork that had nothing to do with the fraud, a cover for the real message tucked inside. "He's moving money faster. Server access logs wiped Tuesday night. I think he knows someone's watching." Daniel read it standing at his own desk, then folded it into his pocket and forced his hands to stop shaking before anyone noticed. Patrick caught him by the coffee machine that same afternoon, oblivious as always to anything beneath the surface of casual office conversation, holding a donut in one hand and gesturing with the other while he explained, at length, why his fantasy football team had lost its 3rd straight week, despite what he insisted was a clearly superior roster. Daniel listened and nodded in the right places, the way he'd learned to do with Patrick over 3 years of working 2 departments apart, and felt a strange, hollow guilt sitting underneath the small talk, knowing what Patrick didn't yet know about himself, that his name sat quietly attached to thousands of dollars he'd never seen and never approved. "You good, man?" Patrick asked eventually, catching something in Daniel's expression he wasn't quick enough to hide. "You've seemed kind of off lately." "Just tired," Daniel said, the same answer he'd been giving everyone for 2 weeks. Lily, Donna, his own reflection in the bathroom mirror most mornings. Long stretch at work. Patrick accepted it the way Patrick accepted most things, with a shrug and an offer of half his donut, and Daniel found himself, walking back to his desk, wishing he could warn him without warning him, wishing there was some version of the truth small enough to hand a man without breaking something in the process. He thought about Carla Drummond too, a quiet, efficient woman in receiving who Daniel had exchanged maybe 40 words with over 3 years, who was about to learn, the same way he had, that her own name had been quietly turned into a tool by someone she'd trusted enough to never think twice about. He didn't warn either of them. Nora had been clear about that, more clear than almost anything else she'd said at the diner that morning, that the fewer people who knew anything was happening, the smaller the chance Garrett caught wind of the case closing in around him before the evidence was secure. Daniel understood the logic. He hated it anyway, carrying a truth that wasn't his to share. Watching 2 people he liked walk through their days with no idea their names were sitting in a federal case file 2 floors above their heads. That night, long after the building had emptied, Elena called him with a plan that made his stomach drop the moment she explained it. The wiped server logs meant Nora's case had a hole in it, a hole only a backup drive in Garrett's office could fill, a drive Elena knew existed because she'd seen the technology team install it 18 months earlier and never seen it removed. "I can get into his office," she said. "I still have a master key from when I covered his assistant's leave 2 years ago. Nobody's updated the access list since. Elena, this is reckless. If he catches you, if we don't get that drive, Nora has a spreadsheet and a theory, and nothing that will hold up against a man with this kind of money behind him. I need 10 minutes. You watch the hallway from the stairwell, the same stairwell where this whole thing started, and if anyone comes, you call my phone and let it ring twice and hang up. I'll know. Daniel hated every part of the plan and agreed to it anyway, because the alternative was watching Garrett walk away clean, while $2.1 million and a forged signature with his name on it sat waiting to ruin his life the moment anyone official looked closely enough. They met at the building at 11 that night, the parking lot nearly empty, except for a cleaning crew's van near the loading dock. Daniel's keycard still worked, a fact that surprised him slightly, though Elena pointed out that revoking access without explanation would have drawn exactly the kind of attention Garrett was trying to avoid. The hallway outside Garrett's office was dark, lit only by the emergency exit signs glowing green at either end. Elena moved fast and quiet, the master key sliding into the lock with a soft click that sounded enormous in the silence. Daniel stationed himself at the stairwell door, phone in hand, pulse loud in his own ears, watching the elevator bank for any sign of movement. 3 minutes in, the elevator light blinked on. Daniel's thumb found Elena's number before his brain had fully processed what he was seeing. He let it ring twice and hung up, exactly as planned, then watched the elevator doors slide open to reveal one of the plain-jacketed men from the loading dock, already moving down the hallway with the kind of purpose that meant he wasn't on a routine patrol. Daniel had maybe 10 seconds to decide what to do, and he used every one of them badly, stepping out from the stairwell into the open hallway, putting himself directly between the approaching man and Garrett's office door. "Building's closed," Daniel said, voice rougher than he intended. "Can I help you with something?" The man didn't answer. He looked at Daniel for a long moment, the kind of look that cataloged height and build and possible exits, and then his eyes flicked past Daniel's shoulder toward Garrett's office door, toward the thin sliver of light now visible underneath it that hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier. Everything happened very fast after that. The man moved past Daniel without another word, shoving him hard enough into the wall that the impact knocked the air out of his chest, and reached Garrett's office door just as it opened from the inside, Elena stepping out with a small external drive, clutched in one fist, and a look of pure, focused panic on her face. "Run," she said, and didn't wait to see if Daniel could. He pushed off the wall and ran after her, down the stairwell 2 steps at a time, the man's footsteps heavy and close behind them, shouting something into a phone or a radio that Daniel couldn't make out over the sound of his own heartbeat. They burst through the ground floor exit into the parking lot, the cleaning crew's van pulling away in the distance, no other witnesses, no security guard at this hour, nothing but 2 of them and whoever was now closing the distance behind them. Elena's blue hatchback was parked at the far end of the lot, further than it had ever felt before. Daniel reached his own car first, closer, and made a split-second decision that he would replay in his head for the rest of his life. "Take my car, go straight to Nora. I'll draw him toward mine." "No." "Elena, go." She hesitated for exactly 1 second too long enough for the man to close the gap, long enough for a second figure to emerge from the loading dock shadows and cut off her path to the blue hatchback entirely. Daniel watched, frozen for half a heartbeat, as a hand closed around Elena's arm and pulled her sideways, the drive falling from her grip and skittering across the pavement. "Daniel, the drive. Get the drive." A car door slammed. An engine roared to life somewhere near the loading dock entrance, headlights swinging hard across the lot, and by the time Daniel reached the spot where Elena had been standing seconds earlier, there was nothing left but the small external drive lying on the asphalt and the fading sound of tires screeching out of the lot's far exit, carrying her away into the dark. Daniel didn't remember picking up the drive. He found it later in his fist, plastic edges biting into his palm, as he dialed Nora's number with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She answered before the second ring finished. "Talk to me." They took her. 2 men, a car. They took Elena from the parking lot. I don't know where. I don't know. His voice broke in a way he hadn't allowed it to break since the hospital room 2 years ago, and he hated himself for it even as the words kept coming. "I have the drive. I have what she went in for. But they took her, Nora. They took her right in front of me. Where are you right now?" "Halloran's main lot. East entrance. Don't move. Don't call anyone else. I'm 12 minutes out, and I'm bringing people with me." The 12 minutes felt like a different kind of time entirely, slow and sharp at once. Every sound in the empty parking lot suddenly enormous. A piece of loose gravel under his shoe, the distant hum of a highway he couldn't see. Daniel sat on the curb with the drive clutched in one hand and his phone in the other, replaying the half-second when he'd let her hesitate, the half-second when he should have grabbed her arm and pulled her toward his car, instead of telling her to run for her own. Nora arrived with 2 unmarked sedans and 4 agents who moved with the kind of coordinated calm that made Daniel feel, for the first time in days, like someone competent had finally entered the situation. She took the drive from his hand, passed it without looking at it to one of the agents, and crouched in front of Daniel at eye level. "I need everything you remember. Car description, direction they drove, anything on either man's face or clothing, anything at all." Daniel gave her what he had, a dark sedan, newer model, no plate he'd had time to read, a loading dock exit he hadn't known existed until tonight, a man in a plain jacket who'd shoved him into a wall and never said a single word the entire time. "The loading dock exit connects to a service road that runs behind 3 warehouses before it hits the main highway," Nora said, already moving toward her car. "One of those warehouses belongs to a shipping subsidiary registered under the same holding company as Falcon Crest. We've had eyes on it for 2 months as part of the larger case. If they're taking her anywhere close, that's where I'd put my money. Then that's where we're going. You're going home, Daniel. This is exactly the part where civilians stop being helpful and start being liabilities. She went into that building because of me, because I asked her to show me everything. I'm not sitting in my kitchen while you—" Nora's expression didn't soften, but something in her eyes shifted, a recognition of the kind of stubbornness that wasn't going to be argued out of the car. "You stay in the vehicle. You do exactly what I say, when I say it, or I will personally have an agent drive you home and sit on your porch until this is over. Are we clear?" "Clear." The warehouse sat at the end of a gravel access road, a long, low building with a row of shipping containers stacked 3 high along one side, floodlights mounted at the corners casting hard white light across a lot half filled with trucks that should have been empty at this hour. 2 agents peeled off before they reached the main gate, circling toward the back of the property on foot. Nora parked her sedan in the shadow of the tree line 200 yards out, engine off, and raised a pair of binoculars toward the loading bay doors. Daniel sat in the back seat, counting his own heartbeat to keep from counting anything worse. The gravel lot ahead lit harsh and white under the floodlights. 3 trucks parked at odd angles like they'd been left in a hurry rather than positioned with any plan. Somewhere out there in the dark, agents he couldn't see were moving into position around a building that might or might not still hold Elena inside it. And every second of silence on the radio felt like a held breath he wasn't allowed to release. A soft static crackle broke the quiet, one of the perimeter agents confirming a position near the rear loading bay, voice clipped down to almost nothing. Nora answered with 2 words Daniel didn't fully understand, and didn't ask her to explain. Her focus narrowed entirely onto the building ahead, binoculars steady despite the tension Daniel could see in the set of her shoulders even from behind. "Movement," she said, voice flat and focused. 2 men. A third coming out from the side entrance now. Daniel leaned forward despite himself, straining to see anything beyond the floodlights and the dark shapes moving between them. "Is she— can you see her?" "Not yet." The radio on Nora's shoulder crackled, low and clipped. Words Daniel couldn't fully parse, half code and half plain language. Agents on the property confirming positions. He sat in the back seat with his hands clenched in his lap, every instinct screaming at him to move, to do something, anything other than sit in a parked car 200 yards from the place where Elena might be. Then he saw it, a side door swinging open, a figure being half-walked, half-dragged across the lot toward a smaller building near the containers, hands bound in front of her, hair fallen loose across her face, but unmistakably Elena, alive, moving, fighting the grip on her arm with whatever strength she had left. "That's her," Daniel said. "Nora, that's her. I see her. Stay in the car." The order came too late to matter, because Daniel's hand was already on the door handle, because 2 years of watching helplessly while his wife's body failed her in a hospital bed had taught him exactly one lesson he couldn't unlearn, which was that watching from a safe distance while someone he cared about suffered was its own kind of death, one he refused to die twice. He was out of the car and moving across the field before Nora could grab him, low and fast through knee-high grass, the floodlights ahead growing larger with every step, his own breathing the loudest sound in the world. Behind him he heard Nora swear into her radio, heard the controlled chaos of agents adjusting a plan that hadn't accounted for a civilian making a run at an active scene. He reached the edge of the gravel lot just as the man dragging Elena shoved her through the smaller building's door, and turned, catching sight of Daniel's approach in the spill of floodlight. The man's hand moved toward his jacket, and every instinct in Daniel's body screamed at him to stop, to drop, to do anything other than keep running straight at a man who was very clearly reaching for a weapon. A shout cut across the lot, sharp and commanding, federal agents emerging from the shadows on both flanks faster than Daniel had thought possible, voices overlapping in clipped, urgent instructions. The man froze, weapon half drawn, caught between Daniel's reckless approach and 4 armed agents closing in from angles he hadn't accounted for. Hands where I can see them, now. For one endless second, nobody moved. Daniel stood frozen 10 feet from a man with a gun half raised, closer than he had ever been to violence in his entire life, close enough to see the man's eyes calculating odds that weren't in his favor. The gun lowered, slowly, then all at once, hands rising, agents closing the final distance and taking him to the ground, with the kind of practiced efficiency that made the whole thing look almost gentle from a distance, despite how hard the man's face met the gravel. Daniel didn't wait to see the rest. He was already moving toward the small building's door, shoving it open to find Elena on her knees on a concrete floor, hands still bound, a second man standing over her who spun toward the sudden noise with wide, panicked eyes. "It's over," Daniel said, though he had no authority to say it, and no plan beyond the words themselves. "There's a dozen federal agents outside. Whatever Garrett's paying you isn't worth what's coming next." The man's eyes flicked toward the door behind Daniel, toward the sound of more shouting, more footsteps, the unmistakable noise of a situation that had already slipped entirely out of his control. He raised both hands and stepped back from Elena without another word, the fight gone out of him the moment the math stopped favoring him. Daniel crossed the room and dropped to his knees in front of Elena, fumbling at the zip tie binding her wrists until an agent appeared behind him with a small blade and cut it free in one motion. Elena's hands were shaking, her cheeks scraped and already starting to bruise, but her eyes, when they finally found Daniel's, were clear and furious and very much alive. "You weren't supposed to come," she said, voice cracking. "I know. You're an idiot." "I know that too." She laughed, a short, broken sound that turned into something closer to crying halfway through, and Daniel pulled her into the kind of hug that didn't ask permission, the kind he hadn't given anyone since the day his wife stopped being able to receive them. Outside, Nora's voice carried across the lot, sharp with the particular frustration of someone whose careful plan had just been blown apart by a civilian's reckless sprint across an open field, followed almost immediately by the much calmer satisfaction of someone watching 2 suspects loaded into separate vehicles, with their hands cuffed behind them. But Garrett wasn't among them. Garrett's name came up twice in the radio chatter Daniel overheard while sitting wrapped in a blanket someone had handed him, and each time it came up in the past tense, already gone, already in the wind. The kind of man who built systems precisely so he'd never have to be standing in the room when they finally collapsed. "He's not here," Nora confirmed, crouching beside the back of the ambulance where a paramedic checked Elena's wrists and the scrape along her cheek. "Phone's been off for the last hour. We have agents at his house and his last known location, but I think he saw this coming before we did." "So he's just gone," Daniel said. "For now." Nora's jaw tightened in a way that suggested the word "now" carried more weight than it sounded like it should. Men like Garrett don't disappear well. They're used to other people doing the disappearing for them. "We'll find him." Elena reached over from the back of the ambulance and found Daniel's hand, her grip still trembling, still holding on the way it had been holding on since a stairwell 3 weeks earlier. Except now it felt less like fear and more like something else entirely. Something neither of them had the words for yet. Standing in a gravel lot at 1 in the morning, with floodlights overhead, and a man's freedom still hanging somewhere out in the dark. Garrett Voss stayed missing for 6 days. Daniel spent those 6 days in a strange, suspended version of normal life, going through the motions of work while 2 federal agents reviewed every document in the building, while Carla Drummond and Patrick Boone learned, with the particular shock of people realizing they'd been used as someone else's shield, that their names had been silently attached to fraud they never committed. Patrick brought donuts to the Monday meeting anyway, 3 days after finding out, because he said he didn't know what else to do with his hands that wouldn't feel pointless. Lily came home on the 4th day. Daniel met her at the airport gate this time, no security line keeping him at a distance, and she ran the last 20 feet with her yellow backpack bouncing against her shoulders and her stuffed rabbit clutched under one arm, asking him a dozen questions before he'd even finished hugging her, about Aunt Carrie's dog, about the boring work trip, about whether they could still have pizza night even though it wasn't Friday. He told her yes to everything. He would have told her yes to almost anything that week. Elena's bruise faded slower than her wrists healed, a pale yellow shadow along her cheekbone that she covered with makeup for work, and stopped covering entirely once she stopped going into the office, choosing instead to work from the temporary compliance task force Nora had assembled to finish untangling 14 months of falsified records. She still flinched, sometimes, at sounds that shouldn't have mattered. A car door closing too fast in a parking lot, a stranger walking too close behind her on the sidewalk. Daniel recognized the flinching. He'd done his own version of it for the better part of 2 years after the funeral, jumping at phones ringing late at night, at hospital smells that followed him into grocery stores for no reason he could explain. He never told her that. Some understanding didn't need saying out loud to be understood. Carla Drummond cried in Daniel's office the week the investigation publicly cleared her name, not from sadness, she told him, but from the strange relief of waking up every day for 2 months wondering whether a knock on her door would be the police instead of the mail carrier. Patrick Boone, true to character, marked the occasion by bringing in 2 boxes of donuts instead of 1, and made exactly 1 joke about needing better taste in friends, before never mentioning the ordeal again, the way some people processed fear by simply refusing to keep looking at it. Lily turned 8 that August, a small backyard party with balloons taped crooked to the fence, and a cake Daniel had attempted himself, and slightly burned on one edge, the kind of imperfect celebration that felt, to him, more honest than anything catered could have been. Elena came early to help blow up balloons and stayed late after the other children had gone home, sitting on the back steps with Daniel, while Lily ran circles around the yard chasing fireflies, neither of them saying much, both of them aware that something had shifted between them sometime during the 6 days Garrett had been missing, something neither one wanted to rush by naming it too soon. Garrett surfaced on the 6th day at a small regional airport 11 hours south, attempting to board a charter flight under a name that didn't match any government record, carrying a bag containing slightly more cash than airport security regulations technically allowed, and a passport that turned out, on closer inspection, to be expertly forged. Nora called Daniel personally to tell him, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone closing a case that had taken longer than she'd wanted and cost more than she'd planned for. "He's in federal custody," she said. 2 counts of wire fraud, money laundering across state lines, conspiracy, and a few charges related to what happened in that parking lot that I think you'll be very pleased to hear about. This case is going to take a while to fully prosecute, but he's not walking free again anytime soon. What about Priya, the woman who got pushed out before any of this started? We found her. She moved across the country, changed her number, was terrified the entire time that someone would come looking for the wrong reasons. She's agreed to testify. I think she's relieved someone finally listened. Daniel sat with that for a long moment after he hung up, thinking about a woman he'd never met, who'd asked half a question 11 months ago and paid for it with her career and her peace of mind, vindicated now by people she'd never know to thank. The trial, when it eventually came, moved slowly the way these things did, months of preparation compressed into a handful of court dates that Daniel attended whenever his schedule allowed, sitting beside Elena in a row of hard wooden benches, watching prosecutors lay out $2.1 million and 14 months of forged signatures in language too careful and too clinical to capture what any of it had actually felt like. The flashlight in a backyard, the gray sedan outside a coffee shop, a hand closing around Elena's arm in a parking lot. Priya testified on the 3rd day of the trial, a woman Daniel had built an entire image of in his head over the preceding months, and found, in person, both smaller and steadier than he'd expected, dressed in a plain gray suit, answering each question in a voice that only shook once, when the prosecutor asked her to describe the meeting where Garrett had told her she was getting ahead of her pay grade. "He used almost the exact same words with me," Elena murmured beside Daniel during a recess, watching Priya being led out of the courtroom by a victim's advocate. "I used to think that was just how he talked to everyone. Now I think it was a script he'd used before, on someone else, long before either of us." The defense attorney tried, twice, to suggest that Priya's testimony was colored by resentment over her own departure from the company, a suggestion Priya answered both times with the same flat, unbothered patience of someone who had spent 11 months rebuilding a life from nothing and had long since stopped caring whether a room full of strangers believed her motives were pure. "I asked one question about a vendor that didn't make sense," she told the courtroom. "I lost my job for it. I think the resentment, if there is any, belongs entirely to the people who decided that was an acceptable outcome for asking a question." Daniel watched Garrett's face during that answer and saw nothing there worth describing. No flicker of guilt, no visible reaction at all. The practiced stillness of a man who had learned somewhere along the way that showing nothing was its own kind of armor. Garrett didn't look at either of them once during the proceedings Daniel attended. He sat very straight in a suit that no longer fit quite the way his old office suits had, and Daniel found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he felt less anger watching the man than he expected, mostly just a kind of tired relief that it was finally, actually over. Halloran Freight Logistics restructured its finance department from the ground up over the following year. New verification protocols, a real compliance office that answered to corporate headquarters instead of the building's own management, and a quiet, company-wide apology that landed in Daniel's inbox, alongside a formal clearing of his name from every record the fraud had touched. The two men captured at the warehouse pleaded down to lesser charges in exchange for testimony against Garrett, naming 2 additional shell companies investigators hadn't yet identified, and confirming, in flat, unembellished detail, that the operation had moved well over $4 million through 3 different freight companies across the past 3 years, Halloran being neither the first nor, Nora suspected, the last target before the case finally closed in on Garrett's network entirely. He made senior operations manager that spring. Elena, who could have left for any number of companies eager to hire someone with her particular instinct for finding what other people wanted hidden, chose instead to stay, taking the newly created compliance director position with a salary that finally matched the work she'd already been quietly doing for months before anyone official noticed. They didn't talk much about the warehouse, or the stairwell, or the 6 days Garrett spent missing while everyone waited to find out whether he'd ever be found at all. Some conversations didn't need repeating once they'd already happened, once the things underneath them had already been said in the ways that mattered. A hand held in the back of an ambulance, a man running across an open field because waiting safely in a car had never once been an option his heart was built for. Daniel visited his wife's grave alone that September, something he did twice a year without fail, on her birthday and on the anniversary of the day she'd been diagnosed, rather than the day she'd died, because Diagnosis Day had always felt like the truer marker of everything that came after. He sat on the grass for longer than usual that year, telling her, the way he sometimes still did out loud when no one else was around, about the forged signatures, and the gray sedan, and the warehouse floodlights, about a woman named Elena who had walked into a stairwell 3 weeks into an investigation neither of them had asked for, and never once walked back out of his life afterward. He didn't know what he expected from the visit, some kind of permission maybe, though he'd never needed her permission for anything while she was alive, and didn't imagine he needed it now. Mostly he just wanted her to know, in whatever way a person can tell a headstone anything, that the house wasn't as quiet as it used to be, that Lily was 8 now and fierce and funny in ways that reminded him more of her mother every year, and that he had found, somewhere in the middle of the worst few months of his adult life, a version of steady he hadn't expected to find again. He left a single sunflower against the base of the stone, the same flower he left every visit, because she'd once told him, half joking, that roses were too predictable for a woman who'd never once done the predictable thing in her life. Then he drove home to a house with a moon-shaped nightlight still glowing in an upstairs window, and a woman in the kitchen who'd left a note on the counter, telling him dinner would be ready by 7, and let himself, finally, without guilt, feel something that had taken him 2 years to recognize as simply being happy again. What changed, slowly, over the months that followed, were smaller things. Elena started leaving Lily's drawings, the ones taped inside Daniel's desk drawer where clients wouldn't see them, propped where he'd notice them first thing in the morning, instead of buried under invoices. Daniel learned, without being told twice, exactly how she took her coffee, and started bringing it to her desk on the mornings she came in looking like she hadn't slept enough. Lily, who had no idea what any of the adults around her had actually been through that spring, only knew that her father seemed lighter somehow by summer, that the woman from his office came over for dinner more often now, that she'd started bringing markers good enough to draw with properly instead of the dollar store kind, and that nobody in this new, quieter version of their life flinched anymore when a car door closed outside. One evening in late June, almost a year after a whispered 5 words in an office that smelled like dry erase markers had changed the direction of all of their lives, Elena leaned over Daniel's shoulder while he made dinner, the same way she used to lean over his desk, and said something low enough that only he could hear it over the sound of the stove. "Take me somewhere private." Daniel turned, startled despite a year of healing, despite knowing by now exactly what that sentence had once meant and exactly what it no longer needed to mean. Elena was smiling, the first easy, unguarded smile he'd seen from her since long before any of this began. "There's a porch," she said, "right outside that door. Nothing's wrong this time. I just wanted 5 minutes without a 7-year-old asking if we're getting married yet." Daniel laughed, the sound surprising him a little, and followed her out into the warm evening air, leaving the stove behind, leaving the year behind, walking towards something that finally, after everything, felt like it was simply, quietly, beginning.